The warm morning sun peeked through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a luxurious penthouse apartment where a successful tech entrepreneur sat alone at his expensive dining table. Despite being surrounded by the finest things money could buy, something felt empty inside him. He stared at his untouched breakfast while scrolling through countless messages on his phone, business partners seeking favors, acquaintances asking for investments, and supposed friends only interested in attending his lavish parties. With a heavy sigh, he put down his phone and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling city streets below. For someone who had built a billion-dollar tech empire from scratch, he felt disconnected from the real world. His childhood memories flashed before his eyes, growing up in a modest neighborhood where neighbors helped each other despite having little themselves. Those were the days when relationships felt genuine, when people cared without expecting anything in return. His attention was drawn to a news article about wealthy individuals living undercover among everyday people to understand their lives better. As he read further, something clicked inside him. He had always wondered if people would treat him differently if they didn't know about his wealth. Would anyone show him kindness if he appeared to have nothing to offer in return? That's when an idea began to take shape. He had noticed a homeless woman during his daily drives to the office. Unlike others who kept to themselves, she always seemed to be helping someone, sharing food, offering comfort, or simply listening to others' stories. Her actions intrigued him. How could someone with so little give so much? He spent the next few weeks meticulously planning his social experiment. He visited thrift stores in disguise, buying worn-out clothes and shoes. He learned how homeless people in his city survived, where they found shelter, and what daily challenges they faced. He even practiced changing his walk and voice to become unrecognizable. Each step of preparation made him more nervous but also more determined. He knew this experiment could be risky, giving up his comfortable life temporarily, living on the streets, experiencing hunger and discomfort. But something deep inside told him this journey was necessary, not just for his own understanding, but perhaps to make a real difference in someone's life. His company could run without him for a few weeks. He had capable people in charge. He informed his assistant he would be off the grid for personal reasons, ensuring nobody would come looking for him. As he packed a small backpack with essential items, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The person staring back at him would soon be unrecognizable to the world. The night before his experiment was to begin, he sat in his study, writing in his journal, "Tomorrow, I step into a different world." Not as a wealthy man testing others, but as someone seeking to understand true kindness. Maybe in losing everything, even if temporarily, I'll find what I've been missing. He set his alarm for 4 a.m., the time when many homeless people begin their day. As he tried to sleep in his comfortable bed one last time, he wondered about the homeless woman he would soon meet. What was her story? What kept her spirit of giving alive despite her circumstances? Little did he know, the answers to these questions would change not just his perspective, but his entire life. The early morning air was crisp as the homeless woman carefully folded her thin blanket, tucking it into her weathered backpack. She had been calling these streets home for the past 8 months, though home wasn't quite the right word for a life spent moving between doorways and underpasses. At just 34, she hadn't imagined this would be her reality, but life had other plans. Before everything changed, she had worn scrubs instead of layers of donated clothes, helping patients heal instead of seeking shelter from the rain. As a nurse, she had spent 10 years building a career she loved, saving lives and comforting those in pain. Then came the perfect storm: her mother's cancer diagnosis, mounting medical bills, and the devastating house fire that consumed everything they had left. Insurance barely covered half the damages, and her savings disappeared trying to keep her mother comfortable in her final months. When the hospital downsized, she found herself without a job. The unemployment checks weren't enough to cover rent, and one missed payment led to another. Soon, the eviction notice came, and just like that, she joined the invisible people she used to pass on the streets, those she'd sometimes treated in the emergency room. But even without a roof over her head, she couldn't stop being who she was at heart, a caregiver. The streets had their own kind of emergency room, and she found herself using her medical knowledge to help others in the homeless community. A quick check of someone's fever, bandaging wounds with whatever clean materials she could find, or simply offering advice about when someone needed to seek real medical help. These small acts kept her spirit alive. Today started like any other. She gathered her few possessions and headed to the small coffee shop where the kind morning shift worker sometimes slipped her a cup of yesterday's leftover coffee. The warmth of the cup in her hands was a simple luxury she had learned to appreciate. As she walked to her usual spot near the park, she noticed an elderly man struggling with his cart of bottles and cans. Without hesitation, she set down her coffee and helped him gather the recyclables that had scattered across the sidewalk. The old man's wrinkled face broke into a grateful smile, one of those genuine expressions that made her temporary hardships feel a little lighter. She shared half of her coffee with him, listening as he told stories about his grandchildren who lived in another state. These connections kept her going, the shared humanity she found in others who society often chose to ignore. There was the teenage girl who had run away from an abusive home, the veteran dealing with PTSD who couldn't hold down a job, and the single mother who lost everything to medical debt, just like her. Each of their stories reminded her that homelessness wasn't about personal failure, it was about a system that could turn anyone's life upside down in an instant. As the morning grew warmer, she made her way to the local church that offered free sandwiches on Tuesdays. The volunteers there knew her well, not just as someone seeking help, but as someone who often stayed to help distribute food to others. They didn't know about her nursing background, but they saw her gentle way with people, how she always made sure the elderly and families with children got served first. Walking back to her spot, she counted the small change in her pocket, just enough for a cheap meal tomorrow if today's dinner at the shelter fell through. But she knew if someone needed it more, she wouldn't think twice about sharing. Her mother had taught her that kindness was like bread. You could break it into infinite pieces and still have enough to give. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, she settled into her usual place near the busy intersection. From here, she could keep an eye on the regulars she had come to think of as her street family. A cardboard sign leaned against her backpack, but unlike many others, hers didn't ask for money. Instead, it read, "Even a smile helps. Have a blessed day." Because sometimes, she had learned, acknowledgement of one's humanity was worth more than spare change. She pulled out a worn notebook, her prized possession, and continued writing her journal. In it, she documented not just her own journey, but the stories of others she met, their struggles, their small victories. Maybe someday, if things got better, these stories could help people understand that homelessness had many faces, and all of them were human. The wealthy businessman's first morning on the streets felt surreal. His designer clothes were replaced with layers of thrift store finds, his clean-shaven face hidden behind a week's worth of carefully grown stubble. His hands, usually smooth from office work, were now deliberately roughened and stained. The transformation was so complete that his own mother wouldn't have recognized him. The morning chill bit through his thin jacket as he watched the homeless woman from a distance. She sat in her usual spot, sharing what looked like a fresh cup of coffee with an elderly man. Their quiet conversation carried fragments of laughter across the street, a sound that seemed out of place in such harsh circumstances. He watched as she broke a donated sandwich in half, giving the larger portion to her companion without hesitation. His stomach growled involuntarily. Despite eating well the previous night, the morning's anxiety had left him genuinely hungry. This wasn't part of his act. It was his body's first taste of the uncertainty that homeless people face daily. Taking a deep breath, he shuffled toward them, trying to mimic the cautious walk he'd observed in others living on the street. As he got closer, the elderly man was just leaving, clutching his half of the sandwich like a treasure. The homeless woman looked up, and for a moment, the businessman felt exposed, as if she could see right through his disguise. But her eyes held only warmth and understanding. "You look like you could use some breakfast," she said, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Before he could respond, she was already holding out the remaining half of a sandwich. "It's egg and cheese today, the best kind," she added with a small smile. He tried to decline, mumbling something about not wanting to take her food, but she insisted. "I've been blessed with this sandwich, and blessings are meant to be shared," she said simply. Her words carried no hint of martyrdom or self-importance, just genuine belief in the rightness of sharing what little she had. Accepting the food, he settled nearby, close enough for conversation but respecting the unwritten rules of personal space he'd learned about during his research. The sandwich was slightly squashed and cold, but as he took his first bite, it tasted better than any gourmet meal he'd had in recent memory. Perhaps it was the hunger, or perhaps it was the way it was given, with pure kindness, expecting nothing in return. As they ate in companionable silence, he observed her interactions with passing strangers. Some ignored her completely, looking through her as if she were invisible. Others hurried past with obvious discomfort. A few dropped coins or small bills into her cup, and to each of these she offered a genuine "God bless you" that made them pause in their rushed lives, if only for a moment. A young mother walked by with two small children. One of the kids pointed at them, asking loudly why they were sitting on the ground. Instead of hurrying past like most parents did, this mother stopped and gently explained that not everyone has a home, and that's why it's important to be kind to others. The homeless woman smiled and waved at the children, turning what could have been an awkward moment into a simple lesson in humanity. "Kids understand more than we think," she said after they left. "They see people first, circumstances second. We adults could learn from that." Her words carried the weight of someone who had experienced both sides of society's divide. Throughout the morning, he watched as she helped others in small but meaningful ways. When a man in a wheelchair struggled to navigate the curb, she was there to assist. When a lost tourist asked for directions, she gave them clearly and patiently, despite being ignored by dozens of better-dressed pedestrians they'd asked first. As the day grew warmer, she shared her precious bottle of water with him, teaching him without words that survival on the streets was about community, not competition. She showed him the safest places to rest, which stores would let you use their bathroom if you were polite, and which corners to avoid after dark. When a local shop owner came out to shoo them away from his storefront, she handled the situation with remarkable dignity. "We'll move along, sir. Have a blessed day," she said, gathering her few belongings. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness at the treatment. She simply accepted it as part of life and chose to respond with grace. The businessman found himself moved not just by her kindness, but by her resilience. Each small interaction revealed a person who had every reason to be bitter with the world, but chose hope instead. As the sun began to set on his first day of the experiment, he realized that the real test wasn't going to be about him discovering her character, it was going to be about measuring up to it. Over the next 2 weeks, the disguised businessman became a regular presence in the homeless woman's world. Each day revealed new layers of her character, and each revelation made him more amazed by her unwavering spirit. The streets became his classroom, and she, unknowingly, his greatest teacher. One particularly cold morning, he arrived at their usual spot to find her sharing her only blanket with a shivering teenager. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, her face bearing that lost look of someone who had run out of options too young. "The shelters are full tonight," the homeless woman explained quietly. "She needs this more than I do." She spent that night huddled in her thin jacket, but never once complained about the cold. On rainy days, she would gather people under the awning of an abandoned store, creating a makeshift shelter for anyone who needed it. The businessman watched as she organized the small space so everyone could stay dry, making sure the elderly and sick had the best spots away from the wind. Even in the worst weather, she maintained a sense of community, sharing stories and small jokes that lifted spirits despite the discomfort. One afternoon, a well-dressed woman dropped a $20 bill in her cup, more money than she'd seen in days. The businessman expected her to keep it for herself, maybe buy a warm meal or some new socks. Instead, she immediately gave it to a homeless mother whose child had been coughing all morning. "There's a clinic 2 blocks down," she told the worried mother. "They might give you samples if you explain the situation." Her own dinner that night was a half-eaten sandwich from a thoughtful food truck owner. The businessman discovered that her previous medical training hadn't gone to waste on the streets. She became the unofficial caregiver of their small community, cleaning cuts with whatever supplies she could find, checking foreheads for fever, and knowing exactly when someone needed real medical attention. "The emergency room has to treat you," she would insist to those hesitant to seek help. "Don't wait until it gets worse." During quieter moments, she would write in her one notebook, recording not just her own experiences, but the stories of others around her. "Everyone here has a story," she explained one day, not looking up from her writing. "Someone should remember them. Someone should know they existed and that they mattered." Her small acts of kindness weren't limited to the homeless community. When a businessman dropped his wallet one morning, she chased after him for 2 blocks to return it, despite knowing that most people would assume the worst about her intentions. The man was so moved by her honesty that he tried to reward her, but she declined. "Just help someone else when you can," she said with a smile. "That's reward enough." Even the local shopkeepers, initially wary of homeless people near their stores, began to trust her. She kept her area clean, discouraged troublemakers, and always moved along politely when asked. Some began to save day-old pastries or coffee for her, which she invariably shared with others. One coffee shop owner even started leaving out clean water every morning, knowing she would make sure it was distributed fairly. The businessman watched as she navigated the complex social dynamics of street life with remarkable wisdom. When tensions rose between 2 homeless men over a prime sleeping spot, she mediated the dispute with patience and fairness, suggesting they alternate days. Her solution not only resolved the conflict, but created an unexpected friendship between the 2 men. Through all of this, she never lost her sense of dignity or her ability to see beauty in small things. She would pause to admire sunsets, thank people for the smallest kindnesses, and always had an encouraging word for others, even on her hardest days. "We might not have much," she often said, "but we still have our humanity. Sometimes that's enough to keep going." One particular moment stuck with the businessman. A group of school kids on a field trip passed by, pointing and whispering. Instead of shrinking from their stares, she waved and smiled. Later, one little girl broke away from the group to give her a granola bar from her lunch. Instead of eating it, she saved it for an elderly man who often missed the shelter's breakfast time. "That little girl might remember this moment," she said. "Maybe she'll grow up knowing that kindness matters more than judgment." The morning started like any other, with the usual bustle of city life swirling around their quiet corner of the street. The disguised businessman had been planning this moment carefully, a test that would reveal the true depth of the homeless woman's character. Though he felt guilty about the deception, he needed to understand just how far her kindness would extend. As the morning crowd thinned out, he began his performance. His hands started trembling first, then his breathing became labored. He stumbled slightly, catching himself against a wall. The homeless woman noticed immediately, her former nursing instincts kicking in as she quickly made her way to his side. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. She helped him sit down, her experienced hands already checking his pulse. "When was the last time you ate something?" He shook his head weakly, playing the part he'd rehearsed. 2, maybe 3 days, he mumbled. It wasn't uncommon for homeless people to go without food for days, he'd learned during his research. Her face showed understanding rather than pity. Without hesitation, she reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a small plastic bag containing her own lunch, a half sandwich she'd been saving for later. "You need to eat something right now," she insisted, breaking the sandwich into smaller, manageable pieces. "Small bites, okay? Don't rush it." But she didn't stop there. He watched through half-closed eyes as she counted the few coins in her cup, money she'd been saving for her own meal that evening. Without a second thought, she stood up. "I'll be right back. Don't try to move." She returned minutes later with a bottle of orange juice and some glucose tablets from the nearby pharmacy, purchases that had likely cost her entire day's collection of spare change. "The sugar will help," she explained, opening the juice for him. "Drink it slowly." As he sipped the juice, she spoke to him softly, checking his symptoms with the expertise of her medical background. Her questions were precise, her touch gentle but professional. When someone suggested calling an ambulance, she assessed the situation carefully. "Let's wait a few minutes," she said. "Sometimes all the body needs is some sugar and rest. But if you start feeling worse, we're getting you help, no arguments." The businessman noticed a small crowd had gathered, but the homeless woman managed the situation with calm authority. She asked them to give him space, thanked them for their concern, and politely declined their offers of calling 911, knowing how expensive an ambulance ride could be for someone without insurance. Hours passed, and she stayed by his side, missing her usual afternoon rounds of checking on other regular street folks she looked after. He knew she also missed her chance to get a spot at the shelter. They filled up early, especially on cold days like this. Yet she showed no signs of leaving, her focus entirely on his well-being. As the day grew colder, she draped her thin blanket over him, ignoring her own discomfort. "Your body needs to stay warm while it recovers," she explained, rubbing her own arms for warmth. She shared stories to keep him alert, talking about her days as a nurse, how she used to help patients through similar situations. Her voice remained steady and reassuring even as the temperature continued to drop. A kind coffee shop worker who knew her brought over 2 cups of hot coffee. She accepted them gratefully, but insisted he drink both. "You need the warmth and sugar more than I do," she said firmly. When he protested, she smiled and added, "I've gone without coffee before. It won't kill me." Throughout the evening, she continued to monitor him, checking his pulse, asking about his symptoms, making sure he was drinking water. She shared the last of her emergency snacks, a squashed granola bar she'd been saving for a truly desperate day. "Consider it medicine," she said with a gentle smile when he tried to refuse. As night approached and his condition improved, he suggested she go find a place to sleep. The shelters would all be full by now, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. But she shook her head. "I'm not leaving until I'm sure you're stable," she insisted. "There's an all-night diner nearby where the owner sometimes lets us sit if we buy a cup of coffee. Once you're stronger, we can head there." The businessman felt a lump in his throat. Here was someone who had nothing, giving everything: her food, her money, her blanket, her shelter opportunity, all to help a stranger she thought was in need. Her kindness went beyond simple charity. It was a profound expression of human dignity and compassion. As he pretended to slowly recover, she finally allowed herself to relax slightly, though she continued to watch him with concern. "Promise me you'll get something to eat tomorrow," she said firmly. "Even if you have to go to the shelter. Pride isn't worth your health." The irony of her words, this woman who had given away her last dollars lecturing about the dangers of pride, wasn't lost on him. The air felt heavy with tension as James slowly pushed back the hood of his worn-out jacket. His weathered hands, carefully prepared to look rough and calloused, trembled slightly. The busy street corner seemed to pause, the usual city noise fading into background static. Maria's eyes widened, not with shock or anger, but with a look of profound understanding that caught James completely off guard. Years of street wisdom had taught her to read people, to see beyond appearances. She had seen through his disguise long before he realized it. "I knew you were different," she said softly, a gentle smile spreading across her weathered face. "But different doesn't mean bad. Different can mean someone's searching for something real." James felt a lump form in his throat. All his carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. He had come to test her, to prove some grand theory about human kindness. Instead, he found himself feeling like the one being examined. "I wanted to understand," he began, his voice catching, "to see what real kindness looks like when nothing is expected in return." He pulled out his wallet, a habit from his usual life, then quickly stuffed it back, feeling suddenly embarrassed. Maria chuckled. It was a warm sound filled with life experiences that no amount of money could buy. She reached into her small bag, more of a collection of memories than a practical container, and pulled out a slightly crumpled photograph. "Want to know about real kindness?" she asked. The photo showed a younger Maria standing in front of a small church. Behind her were several children, their faces bright despite clearly wearing second-hand clothes. "I used to run a small community program," she explained. "Not because I had money, but because I had hope. These kids, they didn't have much, but they had each other." James listened, captivated. This wasn't the sob story he expected. This was a narrative of resilience, of finding joy in the smallest moments. Maria continued sharing stories about helping other homeless individuals, about creating makeshift support networks, about maintaining dignity in the most challenging circumstances. "People think being homeless means being helpless," Maria said, her eyes sparkling with an inner fire. "But we're survivors. We look out for each other. That sandwich I gave you, that's not charity, that's community." The conversation flowed naturally, breaking down the invisible barriers between their worlds. James realized his experiment had transformed into something much more profound. He wasn't just witnessing kindness. He was experiencing human connection in its purest form. As the afternoon light began to soften, casting long shadows on the street, Maria spoke again. "Life isn't about how much you have. It's about how much you're willing to share when you have almost nothing." Her words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. James felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about a social experiment anymore. This was about understanding the true meaning of human worth. "Would you be interested in helping others like yourself?" James finally asked, his voice careful and respectful. Not as a handout, but as a genuine partnership. Maria's smile was answer enough. It wasn't about the potential financial support. It was about being seen, about being heard, about being recognized as a person with value, with stories, with wisdom. The street corner, which had been just another urban landscape moments ago, now felt like a sacred space of human understanding. Two individuals from completely different worlds, connected by a moment of genuine humanity. As they continued talking, the busy city moved around them. Pedestrians rushed past, caught in their own narratives, unaware of the profound connection being forged just inches away from their hurried steps. This wasn't a story of a rich man helping a poor woman. This was a story of mutual respect, of breaking down societal barriers, of recognizing the extraordinary potential that exists in every human being, regardless of their current circumstances. The weeks following their street corner encounter were nothing short of miraculous. What started as a simple moment of connection had begun to reshape entire communities, one life at a time. James didn't just write a check or create another forgotten charity. He listened, really listened. Maria became more than a recipient of help. She became the heart and soul of a movement that would change how people thought about homelessness. Their first project started small. A tiny community center in the most overlooked part of the city. It wasn't fancy, just a warm space with clean walls, some second-hand furniture, and hope painted into every corner. Maria knew exactly what people needed because she had lived their struggles. "Hot meals are good," she would say, "but people need more than food. They need respect. They need a chance to rebuild." The center became a lifeline, not just a place to get a meal, but a place to find dignity. Job training programs started taking shape. Local businesses, hearing about the initiative, began opening their doors to individuals who had been previously invisible to the job market. One morning, a young man walked in. His clothes were worn, his eyes carrying the weight of countless rejections. Maria spotted him immediately. She'd seen that look before, the look of someone who had almost given up. "What skills do you have?" she asked, her voice warm but direct. He stammered about some basic computer knowledge he picked up at the library. Within a week, James had connected him with a local tech company looking for entry-level support. 3 months later, that same young man was supporting his family, his first steady paycheck bringing tears to his mother's eyes. Stories like these became the norm, not the exception. The community center wasn't just helping individuals, it was rebuilding hope, one person at a time. Local volunteers started showing up. Some were former homeless individuals, others were professionals who had been touched by the center's genuine approach. James found himself transformed more than anyone. The businessman who once lived behind spreadsheets and profit margins now spent his days listening to stories, understanding struggles he had never imagined. His tech background became a tool for change, not just for making money. They created a unique support system. Job training merged with mental health support. Legal aid became available for those struggling with identification issues or past legal complications. The center became a beacon of hope in a city that had too often looked away. Maria's wisdom became the guiding principle. "Everyone has a story," she would tell volunteers and supporters. "Nobody chooses to be homeless. Life happens. And life can change just as quickly." Local media started picking up their stories, but this wasn't about creating heroes. It was about showing real human potential. Each success story was a testament to what happens when society decides to see people truly see them. The impact spread beyond the initial neighborhood. Other cities began reaching out, wanting to understand their model. But James and Maria knew there was no simple formula. It was about genuine human connection, about breaking down the invisible walls that separate people. 1 year after their first meeting, the community center had helped over 200 individuals find stable employment. Families were reunited. Hopes were restored. And it all started with a simple sandwich shared on a street corner. During a small celebration marking the center's first anniversary, Maria looked around the room. Faces that once carried defeat now shone with possibility. She caught James's eye and smiled. No words were needed. They both understood that true wealth wasn't about money, it was about the ability to create meaningful change. The city had changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the small moments that truly matter, in the smiles of children who now had stable homes, in the pride of individuals who had found their path, in the community that had learned to see beyond appearances. What began as an experiment had become a movement, a reminder that compassion isn't just a feeling, it's a powerful force that can reshape lives, one human connection at a time.